Okay, I think I hit the right combination of buttons. And we should be live on YouTube. Welcome to the fireside chat about data visualization and accessibility. Like I said, welcome. So this is one in a series of fireside chats, and this particular chat focuses on accessible data visualization. And so I'm from the Data Visualization Society. I am Amy Cecil. I will be the moderator for this discussion, and I'm a co-founder and current board member of the society. The Data Visualization Society was founded to serve as a professional home for those working across disciplines while leading others into this growing dynamic field, and to increase the visibility and value of data visualization in the general public. Our mission is to connect data visualizers across tech stacks, subject areas, and experiences. So you can become a member at datavisualizationsociety.org. And if you are watching this live and you are a general or a patron member, you can log into the Data Visualization Society website and submit questions to be asked during this chat. If you are watching the recording, then just stay tuned and maybe you can ask questions for the next one. And with that, I will let my panelists introduce themselves. So Øystein, do you want to go first?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Honored to be here. First of all, thank you for the invite, Amy. My name is Øystein Moseng. I am head of accessibility with HighCharts. We're the developers of the HighCharts programming library and some other database tools. Yeah, so these days I spend most of my time with HighCharts, rigging our organization for accessibility overall, really, and also trying to find ways to make our charts more accessible to everyone, and trying to develop tools for our customers to help them make accessible visualizations. So happy to be here and getting to talk about accessibility and database.
Hi, I'm Frank, and I'm a data experience engineer and designer, formerly of Visa Incorporated. I worked on Visa Chart Components, which is an open source library. We also worked to make accessible. It's a design system component library. And in my spare time, I've kind of worked with a bunch of really exciting, cool people from all over the world, everybody here actually included, as well as collaborated with a lot of folks to produce a kind of framework for auditing accessibility of data visualizations, and that's called Chartability.
Yeah, I'm Sarah Fossheim. Thank you for having me as well. I'm a developer and designer coming from the UX perspective. When I was working on dashboards a couple of years ago, by trying to make them more user-friendly, that's how I got into accessibility. And since then, I've been focused on both general web accessibility and how to make database more accessible, both in a professional context and also in my spare time as a hobby with a lot of folks who are also on the call here and others.
And we also have Leonie Watson with us. Leonie, would you like to introduce yourself? Maybe we don't have Leonie Watson with us. We will check back. So first question, how do you define accessibility for data visualization?
Frank, do you want to go?
Sure. I think that defining accessibility is sometimes a difficult task, but really it just means making sure that information and functionality can be accessed, and in particular by people with disabilities. So it just means making something able to be used if it's functional, and if it provides information, that you provide that information, and in particular for people with disabilities. Somebody else can take a stab too if you have like a really nice, like, here's my little quip.
I'm actually going to pause and let Leonie introduce herself.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Leonie Watson. I'm Director of Tetralogical, an agency that specializes in sustainable accessibility, and evidently I can't use my laptop. Sorry about that. My interest in data visualization accessibility comes from two sources. One, I'm a screen reader user myself, and like many people who are unable to see the primary content, I still want to know what's in it, what all the data is that's there to be accessed. And also, I like code. I like picking things apart and seeing if I can put them back together in ways that work, and particularly with SVG as a way of creating data visualizations, there are untold opportunities for trying to make things work better than they generally do.
And then Leonie, would you like to pick up the conversation and talk about how you define accessibility for data viz?
Thank you. And for me, it's really quite simple. It's something I just said a moment ago, really. It's that as a person who's blind, I can approach some data that has been visualized and make sense of it, and you know, take away from it the information that I might need based on the context, whether that's learning, professional, general curiosity. So accessibility for me is very much about having access to the data.
I'm curious if I can piggyback on that for a second, about your thoughts on the accessibility of the data versus the accessibility of the experience of some of these visualizations that we see these days with data journeys and animations and interactions and what have you.
I think that's a huge part of it, particularly from the experience of a blind person anyway, because one of the hardest things I've discovered about trying to use or access data visualizations is the amount of information I need to keep in my head to be able to make sense of it. And when you've got a huge data set, visually you can take something in at a glance, and you can take in many points of data all in one go and kind of make sense. When you're not able to do that visually, you sort of have to hold information in short-term memory, and for me at least, that can be really difficult, and I don't imagine I'm alone like that. So I think you're right. Yeah, the complexity of the data set itself is a big part of the usability involved, I think.
Yeah, I noticed that as well when working with the usability, even not just the screen reader accessibility, but usability in general of like big data sets. And there's so many different ways of consuming it, and like a table in itself is not going to give you the same information as, for example, the scatter plots. And then when it comes to accessibility, what I try to focus on is indeed like making sense of the data rather than just making the data available. Because often our alternative for a scatter plot, for example, is a table with the data, and then you indeed run into that issue.
Yeah,
a difficult one in my opinion.
I really agree with that. And I think it's one of those things we talk in accessibility a lot about, equivalent experiences. And this is one of those times when I'm not really sure that's the best word. I don't really want an equivalent experience. What I want is a comparable experience. And I might be getting into, deep semantics there, but for me, as you say, the table might be an equivalent to, say, a bar chart, but the experience of being able to use it and make sense of what's in it isn't really kind of comparable, if that makes sense. Subtle difference perhaps, but.
Yeah, I know when we started working on accessibility with our charts, we did some user testing on even with simple charts, just marking up the SVG itself and allowing screen reader users to go through the SVG elements as opposed to a table, and found that in a lot of cases that was preferable, probably for two reasons. partially because there's a different mental model, I assume, when you're going through a chart. And also because in that case, you got all of the information that was relevant to the individual data point at the moment when you got to that data point, instead of having to move between columns of a table. And then there's probably a sweet spot where doing that makes more sense than a table. And when it gets too complex, perhaps you need a table. But I think it's an interesting discussion as we get more technology as well to look beyond just tables. And we have techniques these days with sonification and with tactile graphics and interesting ways to make things more accessible, perhaps than before. So I'm always curious to see if we can kick those tables out. Just from the perspective of a visual user, if anyone shows me a table, I'm skipping past it. Maybe I'll nod politely and pretend that I read it, but it's not something that I'm particularly happy with. And I don't imagine it's very difficult, no, very different from a screen reader user perspective, but it's probably an individual thing.
Have any of you done any user research with sonification or tactile graphics as alternatives? I haven't done any research myself, but as a consumer, I must admit that anything beyond the kind of the most simple sonification, sort of rising tones or falling tones, I find them quite difficult to interpret. I'd be curious if...
Yeah, we've done a little bit with sonification versus tables, and that is pretty much the finding. Or I should say that the more complex the sonification is, the more training you need to provide, or context you need to provide. So I've always viewed sonification as a supplementary tool rather than a primary tool. But I think it's useful. But I'm also a fairly musically minded person, so perhaps I'm biased.
Interesting.
Yeah, just to jump on sonification, there's I forget what they're called now. I'm sorry if you're here. But there's a new kind of sonification podcast going. There was
it's called Loud Numbers.
What's that?
Loud Numbers.
Loud Numbers, thank you. That was what I was searching for in my head. So I'm excited for what the sonification space will explore in the coming years, because my hope, and I'm being an optimist here, is that in the same way we saw an evolution of sort of an unguided kind of engineering of visualizations in like the early, mid, late 90s, then a slow evolution into thinking about how do we communicate better with this medium into kind of the world we live in today, which is actually a fairly robust, like well-developed medium with a lot of like design guidance and tips and tools for producing not just effective charts, but like beautiful charts that are like a wonderful experience. And sonification, I think, is this like gold mine of unexplored, like, like a sine wave is kind of painful, just like this, just throwing a sine wave at some data. But there's potential, I think, when you see some really experimental stuff, like Carney Clears did sonification of a visual in the New York Times, and it was just unbelievably delightful and dreadful. It was about COVID deaths. And so I think that we're kind of embarking in this area too. We're like maybe 20 years behind, I don't know, 10 years, but I'm at least hopeful for this space as it grows, because I think it will bring with it not just accessibility, but also like genuinely pleasant and good experiences too.
Yeah, I agree, and I was very happy when I saw that Apple is starting to support sonification in their technology for iOS and macOS, and I think that's always a good sign that something could become more mainstream, and with that also evolve. So we're looking forward to that.
And I think Apple's actually a good example where a lot of the gestures you make on their touch devices have, audio icon feedback, and you do over time get very used to to what each of those things mean, to the extent that I now quite often will listen for the mainstream audio feedback, not what my screen reader is telling me on the device, because it's quicker and definitely less verbose. So I think you're right. The sort of audio personality of interfaces is definitely something that's going to get more and more interesting.
Yeah, quick shout out to the Apple folks. I think probably some of them will be watching. So hey, y'all. Some of them I have just been very briefly in contact with, and really excited for what they're up to.
Yep.
That sort of leads me into my next question is, so we're starting to talk about sonification and our hope for more sonification in the future. But what else do we see in the future of accessibility and data visualization? What do we hope for?
I'd really like to see some better browser support for SVG accessibility.
Yes. Yes, yes.
Really.
Vigorously nodding, yes. Yeah.
Yes.
That there is so much potential in SVG, and yet the accessibility layer support in browsers is just non-existent, and that's a real problem.
Yeah, I think I would like to see more people just doing research and experimenting with it and trying to contribute to making DataVis more accessible, because I get so many questions about it. And when I started out, the reason I started writing about it was because I could barely find any answers to my questions on the internet as well. So.
Yes, definitely. Same for me too. And having fun with it, that's the other thing. And I think, that's probably where your thinking was beginning there. There is so much fun that we could be having with ways to make data more accessible in the mainstream mention of the word accessible, more engaging, more fun, more interactive. And I think, if we could bring accessibility into that, so we're just having some fun making accessibility part of the experiment we're having with data visualization. There's a lot of fun to be had.
Yeah, I can't possibly agree with that more. I love how I got into DataVis because it was this exciting way to express yourself, but also kind of be true to data. It's this very interesting practice that we have. It's like a mix of communication, but also kind of exploration. And it's in many ways, it's an uncharted space where you can explore bespoke viz, but also refine how you communicate in practical ways as well. And accessibility is it's part of that. It's baked into this just way of communicating. And I think a lot of people, they may encounter accessibility first from a compliance requirement perspective. And it is this doom, this dread, oh, we have to do this thing. We have to bring in an auditor. We have to make sure we catch up. And it's always framed in such a negative perspective. And actually, really, it's the continuation of what we're already doing, which is communicating and representing data in an experience. And that is, it's an exciting space to be in. It's just, maybe stretching ourselves in ways we haven't stretched in a few years, but I think it's, very fun and exciting.
I agree with that. And I think there's a pretty clear extension from accessibility to usability. And I think accessibility is a lot more fun if you make it about usability, and you get people involved, and you do user testing, and you try to bend the technology to get DataVis to work well for people with a screen reader, for example. And so that's always been what drew me to DataVis accessibility as well, that we didn't have all the answers. There wasn't a standard, and you weren't just following a checklist to get this to work. You had to actually think, and I'm sure we'll see more of that going forwards.
And I think the lines have blurred a lot, in terms of the audience. If you go back 15, 20 years, most people were using a keyboard, probably a mouse, and a kind of monitor of a certain size. Some people might also then have been using a screen reader or speech recognition software. But actually now, almost everybody switches between typing, clicking, tapping, and speaking, or having things spoken at them, if you see what I mean. So I think that the whole idea of interaction has just evolved massively, where anybody at any time could be doing anything that once was considered kind of just the domain of accessibility. And that, I think, puts it all firmly in the camp of usability, as you were just saying.
Yeah, I also wonder if framing it more as a usability thing or bringing more usability into it makes it less overwhelming for people as well. Because what I see a lot is that people get overwhelmed when they're like, oh, there's all these checklists I have to do. I have to be compliant. When you frame it as this negative thing, most of the people I talk to completely freeze and end up not making anything more accessible because they're trying to aim for the absolute highest because they want to be fully compliant from the get-go. While if you take a step back and I try to say like, okay, let's just try to improve what you have one bit, and then next iteration we improve it a bit more and we'll experiment in between, then suddenly things start improving much faster.
Yeah, absolutely, couldn't agree more.
I have this strategy, depending on who I'm talking to, I'll take a different approach. If it's somebody in charge of a budget, I'm like, compliance, doom and dread, you need to do this, get it done, punching up, right? Like, you're not doing enough, you're bad. But when I'm talking to a fellow, somebody early career or a fellow designer or developer who's learning in this space, yeah, it's about building a bridge. And obviously, accessibility has this human rights dimension that is lost when you talk about just usability. So it is important to be explicit with, this is designed for people with disability. But if we can onboard people and soften it by saying, oh, it's usability, specific to people with disabilities. And then it's like, oh, it's a better introduction. So yeah, open arms for people who want to get this work done and who do the work, and then punching up for everyone else, get it done. So yeah, that's my approach. I just wanted to say that, like, I kind of wear those two hats when I communicate.
Yeah, getting the messaging right is definitely important depending on who you're talking to. But another thing I like about Sarah's approach is that often if you're meeting a practitioner who's really wanting to do more accessibility, but the conversation with the budget holder and the project manager maybe hasn't happened yet, so there isn't time and space officially in a project. Taking the one little thing at a time approach means that actually someone can sneak an awful lot of stuff in under the radar, almost without really mentioning it to anybody. And I think there's a huge win to be had there as well. It might not have been part of the official brief, but every time you do, if you can just tweak a little something to make it a bit more accessible, like Sarah said, huge improvements can be made that way.
Yeah, that's also exactly how I came up with that approach, because there was always so much pushback of, why are we trying to make things accessible? It's not necessary. And then framing it as making a small user improvement to this small chart while I'm fixing another bug. And then suddenly there's accessibility fixes in the product.
Yeah. And I think that way you can also encourage people to see it as part of doing the job right, professional pride, if you like. Yeah. We take pride in designing things that are beautiful, good to look at, pleasant to read, easy to understand. If we just keep extending that notion to say, look, this is just part and parcel of being damn good at what you do, and that's something I think everybody wants to try and aim for.
I'd love if the Kantar's Information is Beautiful Awards or Malapier had accessibility as a dimension of their judging criteria. So just saying, if anybody happens to be watching this and you are part of those organizations, you should push for it, because access is beautiful. And yeah, it's very important.
You should make t-shirts with that.
Yeah, that was a good one-liner. Access is beautiful. Sort of our next conversation or question is, so how do we make this conversation of accessibility not just a hot topic, but something that we expect people to continuously do? I feel like accessibility has gotten a lot of attention lately, but how do we make that sustainable and something that's just built in as a long-term thing?
Yeah, I think that can come from two places, really. Either it comes from above you, if you're in an organization of some sort, your boss, your project manager, your owner can put pressure on things to be accessible, and legislation can put pressure on things from above, quote unquote, that things are accessible. But it can also come from the designers and developers themselves and content creators, like we talked about, where you've maybe heard the arguments of why it's important, right? And you bring it into your work. Regardless, I think it's probably an awareness game. especially perhaps for the web technologists, whatever that means, because if you're in web these days, there's just so much you should learn, right? You've got probably 1,000 JavaScript libraries that you should know, and you've got all the front-end frameworks, and you've got the CMSs, and you've got the browser APIs, and then when you think you've got the hang of it, someone launches a new phone or something, and you're back to square one. So you kind of have to get those strong arguments out in front of people often enough and communicated strongly enough that they see that this is something that they need to prioritize, and spend 10 hours on this before you learn the next framework. And otherwise, yeah, I think we're relying on the pressure from legislation and from managers to set those expectations.
I think there has been a.
Oh,
sorry, go ahead. No, that's right.
Okay, I'll go. Thanks. Yeah, job descriptions to me were and still are kind of the like, what do you call it when you like test the temp? What's the word I'm looking for? Whatever. To me, it's like the measurement for really how much is top down on accessibility is if you see it in a job description for a job. And in design, it's there, somewhat common. Sometimes it's usually for a specialized accessibility design role or accessibility engineer role, but you see it starting to spread more and more as a general expectation. But in the data viz world, I think I have seen two, maybe, like maybe ever. And that means that, accessibility, one of the cool things I think about accessibility is that unlike the newest JavaScript framework, we've actually had almost the same accessibility standards for 20 years now. And so if you learn this skill, it's actually going to be around longer than whatever the next new thing is that you also need to learn. So this is a really good core skill that can carry between a lot of changing technologies. So yeah, I just wanted to give that little plug.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that the web at large has started to change culturally over the past maybe decade is that more and more at general web conferences, you get accessibility as one of the topics that's covered along with privacy, security, code, design, UX. And I think that's making a huge difference in terms of visibility. I'm not sure whether sort of data viz conferences are quite at that point yet, but I am starting to see that happen too. And I think that gets the message out that accessibility is just one of those tools that everybody needs to have in their kit. The problem I think massively that still really has to be solved though is original education. I'm not sure how it is in other countries, but certainly here in the UK, and I think, in my knowledge of bits of Europe and the US, young people are coming through school, through college, through university, studying, for all these disciplines, and accessibility still is not taught as just a, here is how you do stuff. If it is included at all, it's still a bolt-on, an extra module that you might do, but then you'll still spend the rest of your time at school being taught, examples that are not implicitly accessible by default. And I really think until we fix that, the rest of the industry is going to be fighting a rearguard action, trying to fix stuff because people don't know any differently when they hit the workforce.
Yeah, when I think of what I had in school, I got the very basics. Like we got explained why we had to add alt text and some basics about like semantic HTML is important, but we never opened the screen reader, never tried any accessibility testing or anything like that. And then I remember coming into my first job and the senior engineers were using divs for buttons. So I think there's quite a bit of also junior people who just get thrown into the field and learn from other people who have just been thrown into the field. And there is some education gap somewhere that should be filled with more accessibility related work.
Yeah, and getting it into the onboarding process.
Yeah.
I think for companies that are mature enough to do that, I think is hugely helpful in setting those expectations early.
Yeah, and that comes back to what you were saying, Einstein, about the top down. If an organization says this is important to us, we're going to sort of educate you as part of your onboarding. We're going to make this part of our projects. that has huge influence over, a newcomer to an industry's, willingness to learn and ability to learn.
Yeah.
So we haven't got much to fix then. Fix the education, fix the top down, fix what everybody knows.
Well, I think what we can do, like you mentioned, is, we can, those of us that have heard the arguments and that know a little bit about accessibility, we can always be evangelists. We can go preach at the conferences and tell people that we know, and bring it into our companies and organizations where we go, and do our little bit of work to help, at least.
Absolutely. And I think then we become ambassadors for something we talked about just a little bit earlier, and that idea that this is not a negative thing. It's a good thing. It's a thing you can have fun with. It has positive outcomes. You can learn and enjoy yourself while you're at it. I think that ties back into that idea too.
Yeah, I've actually sometimes had pretty good success with not just guilting people into accessibility, but also telling them what accessibility can do for them. Because ultimately, especially if you're an organization, you're doing accessibility to make the organization more successful. It's not something that you do necessarily just to fit with compliance or what have you. So I think getting those arguments out there is powerful sometimes.
Yeah, and there's a real, sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
And I was just going to say that there's a very direct truth to that as well. There's a talk by Adrian Roselli called Selfish Accessibility. It's an excellent talk. I think it's online, but he basically says, if you do accessibility for any reason, do it for your future self. Because, there's a good chance that as everybody ages, our sight's not going to be so good, maybe hearing, maybe dexterity. So, you might be fully able to see, hear, think, move at the moment, but in 15, 20, 30, 40 years time, you're the person who's most likely going to need this accessibility. So be selfish and design it for yourself in the future. And I love that idea too. It's yeah.
Absolutely. I hurt my back last week, and I had a trouble, sitting down for extended periods of time. So I was doing my browsing, walking around with a cell phone, and it's a lot harder than sitting down.
Yeah, I can believe it.
Just to go on that selfish kind of like train of thought, it ties into teaching early career folks or people who are just learning accessibility and usability also. So there's this argument made by inclusive design. It's a little maybe controversial, but the idea that you can be situationally excluded or limited based on your environment, and that if technology has been made accessible, that can actually still help you. So one example is that I've been fighting this whole time during this call is trying to adjust the lighting in my room because I have the sun facing in. Bright contrast, right? So say if you're out on your phone on a really sunny day, our phones try to adjust contrast, but sometimes they're not always good at it. And then you can't see your screen. And if you're looking at something that's a low contrast data visualization on a very sunny day, you're not going to be able to see it. And if that data visualization was designed with high contrast by default, which is an accessibility choice, it actually can benefit you even when you're in an environment that produces, I won't say it produces disability, but it will produce a limitation or exclusion because of your interaction with technology in your environment. And so, you're not just doing it for your future self, you're also doing it for yourself when you're in weird places or you have situational needs, or it's kind of, you're doing it for yourself all the time too.
Yeah, absolutely. And temporary as well sort of gets wrapped up into that. You might be somebody who has a permanent cognitive disability that makes concentration difficult and you get easily distracted. You might have a bad cold or the flu and be taking meds for that make it really hard to concentrate, and then you're easily distracted. Or you might have situationally been out partying the night before and you've got a bit of a hangover and you're trying to do something and you're trying to concentrate. The kind of net outcome is broadly the same. The duration of those things is different and the cause is different, but the things that will benefit you, the design choices that will help, are largely the same. So I fully support that idea of permanent, temporary, situational disability.
Yeah, we call it the curb cut effect for those listening. If you want to kind of Google this, it's like a very thoroughly discussed thing in the accessibility and disability rights space. So it came from the idea that wheelchair users fought cities to advocate for cutting curbs, which is when you take a curb that's a 90-degree angle and you flatten it into a ramp, and so that wheelchair users could access the city. And as it turns out, that cutting curbs actually has a broadly positive impact on many, many people in many situations with many, things going on. Somebody pushing a stroller, a distracted person on their cell phone is less likely to trip. Injuries are reduced overall. So yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about the need for more education and why we need more people in this space. So what is one thing that people can do to start making their data visualization more accessible? What couple of things would you recommend? Or, yeah, anyone want to take this one? Rather than resources, more just like how do you enter this space? How do you make data viz accessible, either from your own personal experience or what people should do in the future?
It's a good thing to start by looking at is the colors that you're using, and just making sure that the data isn't dependent on being able to see colors or specify particular colors. Red-green color blindness, for example, means someone could have difficulty telling those two colors apart. They're the colors in Western culture that are most often used to say, stop or go, good or bad, those kind of things. So, maybe putting your data visualization through some color filter tools to see how they look when color differentiation isn't as easy to do, and just adjusting the color palette that you're using. That's a good easy first step, I think.
Yeah. I'll also, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was also going to add, indeed, testing your graphs and other people's graphs. There's tools out there where you can put a picture in, and then indeed they give it to you in different types of color blindness, but also learn to use a screen reader, try navigating with just keyboard only, get into the habit of testing for the basic accessibility issues and getting used to them and getting used to navigating a screen reader, because that's what taught me the most, just using other people's graphs, other people's websites, and getting some of the frustration myself and seeing some of the most common mistakes and taking it from there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think my advice would probably be sort of philosophically to think about how all of your users are probably going to be different from you, in one way or another, and that extends to disabilities as well, and to use learning about disabilities and how people with disabilities interact with and explore your visualizations. Use that sort of as motivation to learn more about accessibility and how to design visualizations that work for as many of your users as possible. Because there really is a lot to learn if you want, like we talked about earlier, there really isn't a magic pill. We don't have the answers for everything. So I think you need to find something that excites you to get you motivated into learning and taking a deeper dive into this. But on the more practical side of things, Frank, maybe this is a good time to plug Chartability.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I've put together a framework. It's a list, so you can start at the top and work your way down. And it's not meant as a checklist. It looks like that at first, but you'll realize there's a lot of qualitative evaluation and real design thinking you have to do when you go through it. But it's a way to kind of look at a lot of different dimensions of accessibility as you're designing something. And it's pretty approachable for people who are new to the space. You're going to have to do some Googling. You're going to have to, find some tutorials on screen readers. So it's not something that, the package itself tells you how to do every single step. That's not what it is, but it is a pretty decent place to start. And one thing that I always encourage people when you're learning accessibility, my first step is always time. It's time management. And it's just, if you can put like 10% of your time in the work you're already doing to see how you can make what you're already doing more accessible, that's a great way to kind of start integrating it into your workflow, which is what you'll need to do anyway. And Chartability is not a bad way to do that. You just pick a thing out of Chartability. You're like, I'm going to see if I can do this with my own work right now, this one thing, figure out how to do this one thing. And you'll eventually get good enough where you don't need to check Chartability. You can just kind of, roll with it. I do say, though, that the goal is 25% of your time. And the reason for that is people like numbers, but a quarter of your time, CDC had a survey, and a quarter of all Americans self-reported disability. And so this is self-reported, right? So the numbers could be higher. And that's a quarter of all people live with some form of disability or another that affects their daily life, right? And that means that if you're designing something to be used by people, which is most all design, it should be, you should commit about a quarter of your time to considering disability, because that's a quarter of all people out there. And everybody should do this work. So start out small, set aside the time, and just give it a shot.
Strategy.
Yeah, and I think over time, getting something like Chartability in your workflow as early as possible, especially once you get used to it, I think that's helpful, because I noticed over time, I have started using accessibility issues as like a guiding force for general user experience design. When a graph becomes too difficult to make accessible, it's usually a sign it's not user-friendly anymore. So even the 25% you put in accessibility, it doesn't affect just the accessibility. It also, again, is going to benefit the entire product.
Yeah, very much so. And the other advantage to using something like the Chartability guidelines early in the process is that you're avoiding making mistakes instead of having to go back and fix them later. And particularly, I've discovered with SVG, if you don't write the SVG in the right way, trying to retrofit accessibility pretty much needs a complete rewrite if you're not careful. So yeah, planning it in is much better than trying to fix it later.
And also, if someone else has to fix it and you're telling them later, they're going to be more mad than if you tell them before they start.
Yeah. Good point. Frank, do you have any insight into how much uptake the Chartability information has had?
Yeah, I wish I had numbers for times the website's been accessed, but I could ask Doug Scheppers and FizStudio are hosting it, and he may have those metrics on the back end, which would be really interesting to see. It's generated a lot of emails. I get a lot of emails about it, which is good. So really good stuff. It kind of, if I can very selfishly plug, people will ask me for guidance. How do I actually do XYZ? And I'm one person. It's a huge world of resources that we actually need. In the same way that the DataViz community has really pushed to create tools and guides and resources around color vision deficiency specifically. We have lots of really great tools for testing stuff, as we've already mentioned. Every single aspect of Chartability needs community contribution too. And so if you're curious about how do I do this thing, you should blog your experience while you do it, because somebody's going to have that exact same question. I literally get, some questions like twice a week. And it's one of those things where it's just, if those resources were out there, I could point to somebody's article and say, oh, this is a really good example. Amy's article on alt text, I have sent to probably like 60 people, like, because it's good and we needed it. And so the community needs this stuff. And I think people just don't realize, like, it's an opportunity to actually contribute to this space, is when you run into something difficult, document your experience with that somewhere.
I'm gonna interrupt you and plug Chris DiMartini, who just blogged his experience trying to make his Tableau visualization accessible. And that is something that I've sent to multiple people, of just like, he documented his struggles, and it wasn't like, here's how to do it. It was a lot of like, here's how I failed and here's how hard it was. And that is great to be able to send other people to sort of give them a framework, but also Tableau to be like, this is not working. Can we make this better? So I think you need that push and pull.
I think another nice thing about those experiences when they're documented is that it helps other people not feel like they're the only ones being frustrated, not making any progress with some of this stuff. And that in turn, I think, the more people that are out there saying, look, I have tried and I've tried and I've tried, and I still couldn't find a solution. One day that might gather enough pace, enough momentum for my earlier wish to come true, for the user agents, the browsers, to actually, you know what, there are a lot of people out there trying to do this, and one of the big things that's stopping them is the lack of support for the protocols, the technologies out there.
Yeah, just going off this again, I think it's very meta. I don't know if I think I've told you this, Leonie, but when I first started, it was like late 2017, and there was just nothing online, and I was looking everywhere. How do I make SVG accessible? And her exploration of a line graph was one of the things I found, and it was foundational in how I thought about SVG, its current like adoption across assistive technology, and kind of how I was going to start solutioning and building something off of that. And yeah, I just wish our community at large did this stuff more, and we're okay with putting kind of messy explorations online. Yours wasn't messy, Leona. It was actually really good. But I'm saying, like, people need to be more just more comfortable just saying, like, this is actually kind of hard. What's going on? And working through it.
Yeah, I think as an industry, every single one of us needs to get better at going, you know what? I didn't figure this out. Here's how far I got, but it's okay. I didn't make it all the way, but maybe someone else can pick this up and take it the next few steps. Failure is a good thing. If we fail because we're trying to do something that hasn't been done before, or something we've never done before ourselves, and making the attempt and not succeeding is okay. We should get better at being comfortable with that, I think.
Basically, the call to action here is that everyone needs to try and do more accessibility, and then write or be loud about their experiences doing it. I like that call to action. An easy ask.
That's pretty much how the web happened. I'm old enough and have been doing this long enough to remember the web in its very early days in the 90s, and there were no rules. There was a very simple set of technologies, and almost from the get-go, everything was, okay, how do we do this? I wonder if we can make this do something it's never done before. Can we push this? Can we break it? We did sometimes, quite often. We still do that. But a lot of the energy and a lot of the web as we know it today came about from people who just tried to push it, tried to do something they hadn't done before or hadn't been done ever before. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but that's the kind of essential creativity of the web. And I think that that's something that we could really use more of going forward. Just have a go and see what happens.
Yeah, that's good advice. Last question as we sort of start to wrap this up in our last 10 minutes. What is one resource that everyone should check out about accessibility?
Frank, you had such a great answer to this earlier.
Yeah.
I knew it. We've already touched on this, but there really isn't a single thing yet. And I'll give context-dependent answers often to somebody. So Sarah has some of the best, how to get started in data visualization and accessibility articles out there when it comes to people who are like leaning into design and dev. High charts, if you need to build something and you're like, I just need something that can help me scaffold and make something that works and it's really good and I need to do it pretty fast, high charts. But how do you get started in accessibility in data viz, like as a kind of a journey, a path, something bigger and larger? I don't know. And it's this unsolved thing. And we've kind of already touched on the fact that we really need an active community in this space. That should be the first answer, is that this community here or some central place where it's active and going. Yeah, so my answer is that a little bit of a void right now, but I'll let others jump in too.
I would also add our GitHub, which is github.com/dataviz accessibility, written with the A11Y acronym, where we have collected a whole list of resources, how to get you started, and also very deep, detailed articles around it. So if you're interested, there you're going to find a lot.
A couple of suggestions. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that internally we've been using the EDX Intro to Web Accessibility course just to get people into the principles. And it's a free course, so I'm not selling it for anyone here. But I believe it's based on the WAI open curriculum, so it's high quality content and it's a W3CX driven thing. But just to get people into the perspectives of accessibility and then taking a deeper dive from there, because that course is something that managers can take and that marketers can take and salespeople can take, and then once people have a deeper understanding of what's going on, then you can go from there and you can read Leonie's articles and Sarah's articles and Chartability, and you can go through our GitHub list and start Googling,
Yeah, to add to that, the WAI also has a series of videos called Web Accessibility Perspectives, and they just introduce some of the ideas of different disabilities, the different technologies that people use to interact with technology in different ways. So they are really engaging. They're very short, but a good introduction. The other resource I'll mention is my company, Tetralogical, created 10 quick accessibility tests that everyone can do. They're available on YouTube. And as the name suggests, each video is about a minute long, and it's just a very quick guide to a quick test, not specifically oriented towards data visualization, but again, just general accessibility, much of which you can apply to data viz work too.
And maybe a less digital answer from me would also be especially targeted towards the designers and people who like experimenting, is to look at how people in the real world solve it, whether it's data viz related or not. I think it's really interesting, especially, for example, beauty products, how they incorporate smell and touch and everything to distinguish between different colors or between different finishes on lipstick. You can still feel in some brands whether the outside is smooth or matte. That translates to the actual products. And I think in a space where we have so little good examples and bad examples of data viz accessibility because people are not doing a lot with it yet, it's so interesting for me to also look at how completely different products that are not online are treating it, because it brings so much of the different perspectives. And for example, a book where you can feel a map or a 3D printed graph, how could that work? And just going out and experimenting and kind of looking at how are others solving it as a source of inspiration. I think that can, for those who want to have fun with it, that's a good way to start as well.
Definitely.
Okay, anything else anyone wants to add before we wrap up?
I think one last thing, which is that it's kind of twofold, I guess. We've said it a few times that we want more people involved, and the DataVis Society does have a Slack channel for accessibility. So hopefully somebody can plug the channel in general after this, get some people in there. That's a good place to go to start conversation. And also our group, which is related to the GitHub library that's going to be shared. We're hoping maybe in the next few months, or as this year looks to close, we hope to grow and have more ways to get people involved and collaborate. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that as well. But yeah, please get involved. It's actually a lot funner than you might think.
Yeah, I'd second that. Just join the conversation and start doing it, start failing and owning it and talking about it, because that's the only way that we move this forward. Okay, thank you to all of my panelists today. Thank you to Sarah, Frank, Leonie, and Oystein for having this conversation and letting it be public. Look for more information from the Data Visualization Society. We're gonna publish more Nightingale articles and host another chat about this topic and other topics in the future. Again, if you are not part of the Data Visualization Society, you can become a member at datavisualizationsociety.org. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you to Alec who's been